Hey friends! So, as you probably are already aware, midterm paper prompts have been posted. They are under the assignments tab, so when you get a moment, uh, check them out, read through them thoroughly. You obviously are not expected to write about all of them. You're going to pick one of the prompts that you want to address, and each prompt highlights a different theme that we've been discussing throughout the course of the semester in relation to the stories that we've been reading. And I try to provide some additional questions within the general prompt just to get your brains thinking, get the wheels turning. You don't have to, go through and answer every single sub question. They're really intended to spark some clear original thinking around the particular prompts. And I've given you some suggestions of texts that you can put into conversation with one another. But by no means is this a limited scope of what you can discuss. You can utilize any of the stories that we've read thus far in the semester. The only thing that I would suggest is that you don't focus. You can choose to focus on the fairy tales, but certainly you're gonna want to choose fairy tales from the different authors. If you intend to just write about fairy tales, you might want to do The Company of Wolves by Carter and pair that with the Grimm's brothers version of Little Red Riding Hood. You can kind of discuss them, but you should make sure that you have some point of comparison. You want to look at two different authors, two different time periods, two different social, political, historical contexts, so that you can really yield some richer comparative analysis between the texts. Okay, so you have your midterm paper prompts now. If you have any questions about them, now is the time to reach out and ask them. I'm happy to clarify anything for you, even if you want to start running some ideas by me ahead of formally putting together, some thesis statements and participating in the thesis workshop, which will happen the week of March 11th. Feel free to do so. Okay, secondly, you now should all have your grades and feedback on your short writing assignment. I apologize that it took as long as it did to get everything back to you. I had my children off from school for 11 days, 10 days. Who knows? It felt like an eternity. Okay, so it won't usually be that long of a turnaround. I just happened to be camp momming for a good long while. So praise Jesus, they are back in school. But you all now should have feedback from me, your grades. Generally, I thought that this first round of short writing assignments was pretty strong. I think you all demonstrated a general grasp of, and here's my doggie. Hi, Olive. You're famous. You're on TV. Hi, puppy. Here she is. Look at this puppy. Look at these puppies. Hello. I think you all, okay, go lay down. I think you all demonstrated a good grasp of this type of assignment, kind of had the structure down pat. The more successful short writing assignments did a few things that I just want to briefly outline so that going forward when you're working on your next ones, and even when you're working on your formal papers, all of this feedback, all of these critiques go for both sets of assignments. So you do want to make sure that you have a sort of defined introductory paragraph. In that introductory paragraph, you need to introduce the authors, and you need to introduce them by their full name. Some of you just kind of launched in was Carter's work. You only have to introduce the authors by their full names once. It should be in the introduction. As soon as you do that, you can refer to the authors solely by their last names after that in your essay, but you do need a proper introduction to the authors, and make sure you spell their names properly. Okay? Secondly, you want to provide the titles, obviously, of both sets of works that you're looking at. If you're citing a short story, that would be denoted in quotes. If you're citing a larger text, like a compilation of short stories, an anthology, a formal title of a book, like the Decameron, for example, that would be italicized. Okay, just sort of like technical notes. In the introduction as well, you should also provide some necessary, and it can be brief and it can be sort of basic, sort of social, historical, cultural context for each author in order to sort of situate them. That context should be really a lens through which you examine their works. I feel like I wrote this to a lot of people who had, good analysis, but had they taken that next step to really contemplate how the sort of backgrounds of each of these authors, the time periods they were writing in, the values of those time periods, any particular like historical moments of historical significance, like the Black Plague, for example, in Boccaccio's piece, utilizing this information and utilizing it as a tool through which then to examine the works would have just elevated the thinking in general. And this is something that's going to be really important for you all to keep in mind when you are approaching your formal papers. You really do have to take stock of and consider, not just in briefly mentioning it in your introduction and then sort of dropping it and doing your analysis divorced from, this specific context of each author, but really using it as a way to deepen and refine your thinking on these texts. So you need to do that. You need to sort of introduce the authors by their full names, introduce the titles of the stories that you're working on or that you're going to be discussing, provide some kind of context for each author, and then you obviously need to provide a thesis statement. Some of the weaker thesis statements were more observational in nature. So, for example, both Carter and Boccaccio have morals to their respective stories that help to move the plot forward. Well, this is sort of addressing the prompt, but it's not telling me very much. What were their morals? Were they writing about the exact same moral? How did their different respective contexts, their different backgrounds, time periods, social historical moments of significance, how did this shape their morals? Right? So like those details are going to be what take you from having a sort of general claim, which is not even a claim, a general observation, to an actual formalized argument where you are telling me what you intend to discuss and argue in your essay. Okay, so that's the sort of difference in providing a thesis statement that has an actual claim to it, something that you are actually arguing, something that someone could argue a different way, for example, and something that no one would really contest. Yes, both Boccaccio and Carter do have some kind of morals to their respective stories. So what, right? Play that sort of so what game for yourself if you're not quite sure if you have a real claim at stake. Well, okay, so what? So what's the significance of that? What specifically are they trying to say? How do they compare to one another? Or how do they importantly diverge from one another? And how do their environments influence those particular morals or messages that they're trying to convey? So that's really important to consider going forward for your midterm papers, short writing assignments. Those are sort of the goals of your introductory paragraph. For your body paragraphs, what I saw a lot of was like two separate body paragraphs. First body paragraph on, say, Carter's work. Second body paragraph on one of the stories in the Decameron. And then maybe a little bit in your conclusion on how they connect or engage one another. What I would love to see is two body paragraphs where you consider both texts in conversation with one another. So you're not necessarily talking about them divorced from one another, but you are actually talking about them in concert with one another. And that doesn't mean that in doing that you can't showcase how they actually are diverging from one another. That's like a perfectly reasonable and potentially very productive way to discuss the text. I just mean that you should be considering them in your body paragraphs in relation to one another. This is going to be critical in your midterm papers, especially. I don't want to see, one big body paragraph on one story, one big body paragraph on another story, maybe 2 lines that try to engage them, the end. I really do want to see you work on your connective comparative thinking. Okay, so going forward, try to think about engaging both stories, both authors, within each of your body paragraphs. You could have a particular goal for the body paragraph. You want to highlight a specific point and showcase how these 2 authors are talking about this particular point. You may have a second point that you want to make, and you would do the exact same thing. Both of those points should be outlined in your thesis statement. Your thesis statement, in some ways, is kind of like a roadmap for your paper. It essentially tells the reader what specifically you intend to argue in your paper, what specifically you intend to discuss. This helps me as the reader. If I ever get confused, I can go back to your thesis statement, your roadmap, and be like, oh, right, this person is telling me about this and this. This person is arguing this point and this point. Got it. Okay, now I can follow along. And it helps you as the writer. If you feel like you're, bumbling along and you're like, why am I writing this? You can remind yourself by going back to your thesis statement so that you can stay on point. Okay? And then you should obviously have a sort of defined conclusion. There should be a separate paragraph at the end of your short writing assignments that attempts to, as I said, echo your intro. You want to echo the ideas that you set forth in your intro. You want to echo the argument that you were trying to make throughout your essay as a way of sort of bringing the reader full circle. Okay, so that's just a little bit of general feedback on your first short writing assignment. Just to keep in mind as you go forward with our short writing assignments and as you approach the midterm paper. On your second short writing assignment, the next one will be scheduled for Saturday, March 9th. It's going to be on Poe's The Telltale Heart. Woo! And Kafka's The Hunger Artist. That's a lineup right there, friends. That's a lineup. So I will email this to you, but I just wanted to let you know as well that is when the next short writing assignment will take place. Right now, we are heavily in the midst of our discussion forum on Dahl and on Jackson. Woo, these works are a bit intense. You have 2 literary masterminds, particularly for the short story form, both of which are highlighting the sort of sinister undertones of human nature. We got some of this in Maupassant, in Chopin, where we see, these sort of ironic, dramatic endings where we're not expecting what's coming. We're sort of set up in a certain way, and then we're sort of surprised at the end. But we start to get the sense of kind of some of the darker qualities of human behavior and human nature, such as materialism, or dishonesty, or racism, or gender inequality. We get some of these kind of complicated issues that we start to deal with and unpack. And now we sort of get, in my opinion, an even more sinister look at the human experience and human behavior. We have actual murder at stake here. One individual is in The Landlady, and one even more dramatic and disturbing in some ways is Jackson's The Lottery, because we have a sort of ordained, ritualistic, societal sacrifice, murder of one of its own members. It's important to note, particularly for Jackson's piece, this is in your lecture notes, but I just want to highlight it because it really is critical to sort of our understanding of her perspective. This story was published in 1948 in the New Yorker magazine. Dahl's piece was also published in the New Yorker magazine, but in 1959. So this is kind of on the heels of World War II, atomic bomb, the Holocaust. And so, the world was really primed for having to witness in a very pronounced, cerebral way the consequences of unchecked human behavior, or the sort of really, really traumatic, dark, sinister motivations of unchecked human behavior. So this is sort of like what Jackson is writing out of. And she points us pretty, you know, unabashedly to have to confront some really kind of uncomfortable aspects of society, some uncomfortable aspects of, as I said, human nature, right? We have to look at violence and cruelty in a really pronounced way without clear motivation, which is really what's very challenging about this, right? I mean, the whole setup of the lottery is that we have this unassuming, sunny summer day in a town where people don't want to leave their dishes in the sink, where children are just out of school, where the grass is green, the flowers are blooming, and yet there's something deeply troubling and deeply amiss just under the current of this story. And some of you have really astutely noted that the pacing of Jackson's story is kind of interesting because it's very slow. We get a lot of details, even seemingly insignificant details like how to pronounce Delacroix, right? I mean, like that wouldn't be something that necessarily would need to be pointed out, especially when you're going to have an ending where a town is stoning an innocent woman to death. I mean, that's just a strange detail to put in there. It just throws us off. And really, you know, if you haven't read the story before, your expectations are really, really misled in this story, very intentionally by Jackson. So you have violence and cruelty, you have sort of the consequences of sort of sustained, unchecked ritual, sort of ordained social ritual where no one is particularly questioning why this lottery is still in play, or you know what the function is. The people can't even remember how it started. And Old Man Warner is sort of this bastion of days past, this sort of bastion of tradition or outmoded tradition, who thinks everyone who's challenging the lottery or starting to sort of think a little bit more independently and question these types of behaviors, he thinks, oh, they're crazy pack of fools. These youngins, like they're nuts. We've always had a lottery. This is part of the tradition. So he represents sort of the extreme danger of not questioning certain ritualized traditional behaviors in this. We also get the theme of victimization. I hope we can start to unpack a little bit more. Is it important that, the lottery winner is a woman? What if it was, a man? What if it was Old Man Warner? What if it was Little Davy? How would that change, if at all, our perception of this ending? It's important that it's a woman, and Jackson has a sort of underlying social commentary there as well. And it's also important to note that Jackson's writing this after she had moved from living in New York City in Greenwich Village, this sort of bastion of diversity and intellectual thinking and culture, to this little town in Vermont, where, perhaps things weren't as diverse. Perhaps things were done a particular way and nobody questioned why. Perhaps she was critiquing, for lack of a better term, the sort of simple-mindedness of some of the people with whom she was encountering in this particular part of the country. So that's also something important to keep in mind. And you really see the brutality of human behavior, how people can just turn on each other in order to save themselves, right? You have husbands turning on wives, you have little children packing their pockets to stone their mother, you have friends one minute, sort of throwing their friend, to the slaughter without even a second thought, simply because it isn't them who has to be in that role and in that position. So these are all sort of uncomfortable, icky themes that we have to kind of confront in this story, but really powerful and really necessary for us to sort of do this type of work and to do this type of critical unpacking of Jackson's text. The landlady is uncomfortable, in a different way. It really perverts our idea or our notion of, an older motherly caretaker as a landlady, right? This is not what we don't think of a sociopath, a murderer. That's not the vision that we get when we think about that. It's much more comfortable for us to think of, the big bad wolf being a predator, being a murderer, being sort of animalistic, as we've been talking about in this way, than for this seemingly harmless little old lady. So Dahl really plays with us here as well. He sort of manipulates us and leaves these little breadcrumbs throughout, as Jackson does, throughout the story, leading up to this presumed ending. We don't get the kind of payoff, if that's even the right term, that we do in Jackson's piece, where we sort of know how Jackson's piece ended, even though it's incredibly abrupt, right? There's no ceremony around this action. In fact, the townspeople are like, come on, hurry up, let's get this done. We got to go back to washing our dishes and work and, playing kickball, whatever. Dahl kind of quietly leads us down this really kind of creepy, eerie path as well, but we don't get that kind of confirmation of how the story ends. We can only be little detectives and take our clues and make an educated guess, right? Speculate on how Billy Weaver turns out. So we have to be detectives in both of these stories, and both of them seem to have a lot to say. They both seem to have some interesting social commentary going on about the sort of sinister, the potential sinister nature of humans, and particularly the curious nature of human behavior at times. So I'm just outlining some of these themes. We've already been discussing them in our discussion forum posts. If you haven't posted yet, get posting, get on it. This closes tonight at 10 p.m. If you have any questions, as always, be in touch. And that's it for now. Okay, bye. Happy Wednesday.